Hello, I'm Rupert Suskin.
And I'm Michael Bott. Welcome to another Prehistory Guys interview, introducing you to archaeologists and historians, all too often hidden behind the scenes, and finding out what they're up to while the world isn't watching.
Today we're talking with Dr James Dilley, renowned experimental archaeologist and craftsman specialising in prehistoric technologies. James's skills in producing authentic reproductions of prehistoric tools and weapons has led to his work being displayed at the British Museum, Stonehenge. He's also worked with several high-profile media companies from the BBC to National Geographic.
In 2009, James founded AncientCraft, dedicating its focus towards educating and reconnecting people to their prehistoric heritage. And he's routinely asked to demonstrate all manner of prehistoric techniques, including flint knapping, fire making, bronze and copper casting, even demonstrating copper smelting, going all the way from rock to metal using authentic tools and materials.
He also does a fabulous job working with schools, inspiring young children to become fascinated by the lives of people in prehistory.
So, with that said, on with the interview.
Dr James Dilley, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for joining us. What can I say? We've been talking about getting you on for ages. Whereabouts in the world are you right now?
I'm back in my homeland of North Hertfordshire, born and bred in the area, in the town of Royston, if anyone knows it.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. What's the weather like?
Well, we've had on and off rain, which has made going out to fulfill orders tricky, because you go out, get all the stuff out ready to go, you sit down and then woof, and you're wet.
Oh, the trip to the post office.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely not but bashing lumps of flint or anything, getting cold and wet. It's just... The workshop's nearly done, and I'll have a lovely covered space for me to work away, but not quite yet. Nearly there.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, James, the first question that we always ask, everybody always wants to know, is what was it that first got you into archaeology right at the very beginning?
Okay. Well, I guess to go right back to the start, like many young people, was always interested in sticks and stones and collecting them and walks. I mean, you go out today, especially with the amount of people going and exercising, you see kids dragging along these great piles of sticks, sometimes twice or thrice their size and length. You think, yeah, you could get that in the car. I was one of those kids. And there was this pile of sticks and stones outside the house. But my grandfather was a cabinet maker and made missile boxes beforehand and was very hands-on. Okay. So really encouraged that sort of interest and often made me little benches or tools to have a go with, or, literally just whacking nails into bits of wood. So he really encouraged that practical side of it. But I've got no archaeologists in the family whatsoever, no connection to archaeology other than how I've come into it myself. Soon after that, again in primary school, like most kids, became interested in the ancient Egyptians and mummies and dead people, because kids are morbid. They really are. It's just a fascination. Really horrible little creatures. But I think I had the most mature thought back then in primary school, and not really been able to top it, which is a bit worrying. But realised watching all these endless documentaries about Egyptology and the likes of Dr Zahi Hawass and some of the other great Egyptologists, is that it was Egyptians that were fronting these documentaries and opening the tombs and were doing a lot of the research, quite rightly. The days of English gentlemen going over to Egypt and opening tombs to present to open-mouthed public were long, long gone. So I then realised it's perhaps a good time to become more interested in my local archaeology and prehistory, as the two time periods are relatively close. And I suppose that background of being very hands-on and practical and loving making things, loved Lego and anything hands-on practical. Again, like most kids, this is not an unusual story so far. And as I became interested in the Celts as a young kid, and then realising later that's not what you call them. And going back in time, it became apparent that there was a large proportion of that's not too difficult for a kid to have a go at to their level of interest and I suppose acceptability in terms of success. And watching the great John Lord on TV just picking up a piece of flint and within a matter of TV minutes, bang, 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 beautiful handaxe out of this piece of stone that we have lying all over the place around here in North Harts in the field. That's the sort of thing that as a kid, maybe age 8 or 9, I thought, yeah, I can do that. I can go out in the garden now. I could probably make one bigger and better than that. Haven't really got over that mistake even now. But my parents got me into the Young Archaeologist Club, and I would say that was a big influence in how I became interested in archaeology. And I'm always someone who will stand up and happily say that the Young Archaeologist Club are probably one of the best sources of engagement for young people interested in archaeology. Very well organised, fantastically pitched, so that the content's interesting. And when I was part of the club many years ago, they used to do holidays to different parts of the UK. So you could go to somewhere like Nottingham and be involved with medieval archaeology. You could go to Hadrian's Wall and live as a Roman soldier. There was a holiday down to Cornwall at Treworth Farm, which is surrounded by the likes of the Hurlers and Treheathy Coit and all the wonders of Bodmin Moor that I'm sure you'll both know very well. And on the holiday, which was led by the legendary Tony Blackman, all the kids were able to have a go at flint knapping, bronze working, leather, bone working, and see all these amazing sites that are there on Bodmin Moor, roundhouses with most of their walls still intact. And for me, I mean, I was sold. That's what I wanted to do. You know, if there's a career in this, that is just my perfect cup of archaeologically themed tea. It was all the practicalities that I had looked for, I suppose, or that was my niche. And I suppose for something like flint knapping, it's a craft that I could easily have a go at because, again, raw material lying all over the place. Loved bronze casting and the idea of it, but when you're about 9 or 10, 1,000-degree furnace with liquid metal and swords is a little bit out of reach. So I had to give that a few years.
Do you have a preference for working with stone or metal?
Depends on the day.
Okay.
If the flint's not behaving, then bronze. If it's a bad cast, it's back to flint. They're both generally quite poorly behaved, and you have to sort of rope them into, you will be an axe head or you will be a sword. But same problems in the past, I'm sure.
But it's not just, an interest and something that you really took up. I mean, you seriously went for it. You had your archaeology A-level before you took the rest of your exams, didn't you? And your AncientCraft was up and running before you'd left school, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I really have to credit some of the family and friends around me. Both my parents, I would not be where I am without them, without a shadow of a doubt. They got me in touch with the local museum, and via the local museum introduced me to a retired archaeologist in the town, Sylvia Beeman, who wrote a lot about Royston Cave, the Templar chalk cave under the High Street. And she, still is my mentor, I suppose, and has guided me from a young person interested, bringing in bits of Roman tile and pottery from the farm that I used to work on as a young farmhand. And as you said, I did my GCSE archaeology back when they did that in year 9, and did the A-level archaeology the following year before I'd done my GCSEs. But I think that was must have been coming up to the final years they did the A-level as well. I've just phased it out quite quickly. And my dad, who has a background in IT and has worked for Microsoft, Hitachi, a lot of computer data, big companies, helped me make this very, very basic WordPress
Yes.
Website. Very, very basic. Looking back on the old copies of it, you're thinking, really? Those colours, those pictures. But the website is 13
But way back then, when you were how old? 17, 18?
But when?
When the first AncientCraft went up.
In 2009, so it must have been 16, maybe.
Yeah. So what idea did you have in mind when it first went up? Where was it going?
To begin with, it was put together as a website to just sort of show this is me. This is a little bit about what I do. Yeah. There wasn't much of an objective, I suppose. Yeah. It certainly wasn't a shop or anything like that. It was shortly after local museums were saying, could you come and do a demonstration?
Yeah. So that the thing is that has blossomed, just having a website showing what you can do. Yeah. But over the years now, you've worked with a huge list of amazing organisations from the British Museum, BBC, National Geographic. You've become pretty much the de facto go-to guy for anything to do with prehistory when it comes to the media, whether it's doing demonstrations or living history or the artifacts that you create. Is there any, looking back or looking forward, is there any particular aspect of what you've ended up doing that if somebody asked you, you could only do one bit for the rest of your life, which bit would it be? Would it still be knapping, or would it be something else that's sort of fallen into your lap in the interim?
It's a tough question, and I suppose it would have to be something between flint knapping or bronze casting. I enjoy both, and I suppose my core is flint knapping simply because I've been doing it longer, and that's generally what I'm well known for. So I suppose if I had to choose between the two, it might be that. But again, it depends on the day, whether I've had a rubbish casting day or a bad flint knapping day.
You see,
go on.
Yeah, there's the thing. It is possible to have a bad flint knapping day,
Yeah, you just don't see that on social media.
That's, yeah.
You talking about that? You see, we recently did a broadcast about those amazing rock crystal weapons that were found in southern Spain.
Yeah.
And one of our admins is a chap called Jeff Watson. He's a pretty accomplished flint napper, and we've seen some of the beautiful pieces that he's made from glass. He's napped with glass. And we know that you work with glass as well. But as a comparison, do you know how hard would it be to make those kinds of artifacts out of rock crystal?
Rock crystal's very similar to glass. It's very similar silica structure. And I've actually got somewhere around here, some silica crystals that are about the right length for that dagger that I keep thinking, I should have a go at that. But glass snapping, I've done on and off, and I've been lucky to help out a glass college in Scotland, and just happened to be there by chance. The manager just came across me while I was there and said, "Can you nap glass?" And he's watching you nap flint. So, yeah, you can. It's just tricky getting hold of big chunks of it. Usually it's just bottle glass I have to work with. And he said, "I'll pop by the college tomorrow because we've got some sort of glass bricks about as long as your arm or sometimes bigger." Oh, wow. And turned up and he said, "Yeah, there you go, have it." And I've since been able to give them a couple of pieces that they've put in galleries and displays at places around the world, and it's nice to have that exchange. And doing what I do, a big part of it is meeting so many people by chance and having these amazing either exchanges of physical things or information, or just having that interesting relationship by a chance meeting. And I suppose in a similar way, not glass, but meeting now a good friend who lives at the bottom of the Rhagllwyd Neolithic Axe Factory in North Wales. Uh-huh. We bumped into each other because as I walked past his house and he was in the garden, he had a Series 1 Land Rover, and I still had mine at the time, and got talking about it, as Land Rover drivers do. If they can't acknowledge each other as they're driving along, they always get chatting. And we just struck up a friendship from there. And he was involved with the local heritage centre, and go and see him every year. And it's just those sorts of local connections, doing this sort of thing and being involved in local communities when you're doing an event or workshops, I absolutely love. You learn so much about the people who live in that area and about how they feel about certain sites or places. It's quite a different way of being involved with people's local feel for their local monuments and local archaeology. Sometimes you're really surprised because it's sort of like, oh, well, there's some stones over there. But in other occasions, people know a ridiculous amount, information you can't easily find. It is a big pro of what I do.
Yeah, information that you wouldn't come across unless you're in the vein. People start coming to you. I think that, yes. Wow. I mean, actually, talking about stone axes and the quarrying of, we know that stone axes had a special place for Neolithic people, and greenstone axes have been found vast distances away from where the rock was originally quarried, and these have always been kind of regarded as somehow symbolic, and not so much the practical. Do you have any thoughts on that, about the division between the symbolic and the practical, the emblematic, and whether people actually used them or not?
I knew it was going to be a slightly controversial question, but
we
it's a question that I like, because I suppose I try to approach it and purely based on opinion and interpretation over the years. The likes of the greats of Alison Sheridan, who have their own opinions, and various other well-known prehistorians have their opinion on particularly greenstone axes and various others. But I've worked with a very few types of lithic material from the British Isles that I haven't worked with now. I've worked with jadeite, of course, the likes of Langdale Tuff, Group 6, and the frag fluid Group 7, to name a few. And having made lots of the axes and tested them for tree felling and woodworking, the best axes by far are the volcanic axes, whether that be frag fluid or the Langdale Tuff. They flake, and those two in particular, I'll stick with them for now, the frag fluid and Langdale axes. They're really easy to flake. They're as easy to flake as flint, and they polish in half the time because they're not as hard as flint. And I suppose the thing to bear in mind is that an axe head is a high energy tool. It's going to be hitting a hard surface continually. A lot of shock's going to be going through it. And that kind of shock is very similar to flint knapping. You always strike the edges with flint knapping, or almost always, to undercut material that comes off the bottom as a flake. And through that, the process is quite similar. So if you've got your axe head continually smashing into the face of a tree trunk right at the very thin blade, similar levels of shock or types of shock are travelling through the axe head. Flint is very, very hard, and for anyone who's reasonably familiar with flint, if you tap it, sometimes it really rings like a sheet of steel or glass. Very similar to glass in its chemical composition. Glass is very fragile. It's very hard. If you try and squeeze it, you can't. But if you try and break it, it's a lot easier because hardness comes with brittleness. The volcanic axes are not quite as hard. They have some elasticity to them, and that's simply because they generally don't have as much silica in and other minerals as well. And that gives it that slight composite strength. That means that it can withstand compression stress and twist strain if it was in an axe handle that flint generally can't. And as I said, the beauty of volcanic axes is you can polish them in half the time. A flint axe, 20 centimetres or so, 60 hours work, roughly. A big investment of time. It makes a huge difference to the functionality, and I'll get onto that. But for the volcanic axes, 30 hours or less. Massive difference.
Wow.
And they can look aesthetically very, very pleasing, certainly for Langdale axes, and you can understand why theories have come about their purely aesthetic qualities over functionality. But to get on to the reason behind polishing, A study in Scandinavia found quite clearly that by polishing the surface of any flaked stone, you take away all those ridges and troughs that you get from flake scars, and you see those flake scars on handaxes, axes, all kinds of flake stone, not necessarily flint. Each time the edge is struck, whether it be flint knapping or to be struck against a tree, the shock that you put through it will travel and focus along the surface, but if it can, along those ridges, the edges of flake scars. That means you're going to get localized stress. And as you have that repetitive strain as it strikes the tree, that stress is going to build up. It can't easily travel through the axe quick enough often. And with something very brittle, localized stress will lead to microfractures. And as that builds, the axe head can fail and break. If the surface is totally smooth, the shock, which will try and travel at the surface, has to travel evenly. There are no areas it can localize. So you're reducing the overall stress going through the axe head and reducing the chance of microfractures and failure simply by removing the topographic features. It's amazing to realize that people understood not just, you can hit rocks and you can understand how the flakes come off, but looking at how to improve the longevity of the object. And you don't just see that in the Neolithics, far earlier too.
So would that extend to the even more exotic stones, like those from the Italian Alps?
I think the jadeite axes are a bit of a specialism. They're extremely early. And I think, certainly looking at various research that's out there, even by the time they get to Britain, they're thought to be very old by the time they get here already. And like the exchange of shells in islands around the Pacific, there's value that builds as they're traded and they gain their own heritage. However, some of the axes are very thin, some of them are not. They're more torpedo-shaped. And people have suggested that jadeite is just not strong enough to withstand being turned into an axe head and used. But go and look at footage of people in Papua New Guinea felling trees with jadeite and nephrite axes. It's an extremely hard material. So it's possible that some of them were used, but for the high level of polish on some of them that you see in Devizes Museum have got sort of a mirror-like finish, and it's almost imperial jade quality. I'm not sure I'd use it.
No. No. Amazing. That's really interesting, actually. Well, okay. When it comes to metalworking, all right, now, one of the skills that just seems so difficult is recognizing ore-bearing rocks in the first place.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a bit about, the whole process of ore extraction, really?
Sure. And I often get asked, how do people come across metal? Do you just sort of find a lump of it in the ground? And no, sadly, it's not Minecraft. But it's an interesting tale, I suppose. And people have suggested that there might have been a handy piece of ore in a pottery kiln. And when they opened the kiln, there just happened to be some smelted metal at the bottom of it. But for most prehistoric pottery kilns, as the likes of Graham Taylor will tell you, they just didn't get to the right kind of temperature to start to get the metal out. It needs to be over 1,000 degrees. And they certainly weren't achieving that. It's likely that in areas like Bulgaria and many others, Varna Cemetery is a good example, is very well known. There was an awful lot of native copper, and any kind of metal that has the label native in front of it means that it occurs naturally in a metal state. And gold is one of the better known ones. It's very rarely called native gold because most gold is in the natural state. It's very resistant to oxidizing, but copper can as well. And for native copper, you can cold work it. You don't need to heat it up to deform it into shape. And there's that recent bit of news out about the first coppersmiths in North America that around 8,000 years ago or so. It's likely that they were coming across native copper in areas like Michigan and just beating it into shape. But the key thing is that you've got that material as a raw material, and they would, in North America anywhere, if they had that material, if they'd left the object out or it got a bit wet, it would have oxidized, and they would have noticed that green effect that we see on our copper pipes around, or mainly outside our houses. and that connection would have been easier because for native copper, it's usually found with copper ore. And for a very well-known copper ore like malachite, which is that really lovely green ore that's often polished into elephant shapes or dishes, it has that real distinctive green colour, and it's quite heavy. And people who are so used to making things from stone would have noticed that there's a connection here. Our native copper tools are going a bit green. This rock I've just found is the similar colour of green, and it's quite heavy. There's something here. And if you work any metal, if you start hitting it, it generally warms up as the metal starts to deform. And as these very early coppersmiths started to bash their native copper, it would have warmed up. And it's likely that someone, as with the early Heath Robinsons of prehistory, probably tried to warm up these objects and realised it's a little bit easier to work, and kept trying to heat it up until the point they possibly melted the stuff and then just poured it into a mass or a shape. And at that point, you're not just cold working it, you're casting it. And that's where that jump probably occurs, is that they realise, we can cast this stuff into shapes now, we don't have to bash it. I wonder if we can put some of this rock in at that heat as well and get this copper out, because that native copper resource would have run out. So the jump is a lot more gradual than is generally appreciated. And I'm not saying that is the definite way, it just seems like a logical gradual step. For something like tin ore, this very unassuming grey rock, how on earth did people come across that? But in Cornwall, you get veins of lead, copper and tin, and it's quite possible that someone was going after copper, tried to go through the smelting process and sort in the ore, and by pure chance came up with a very, very rich piece of cassiterite, tin ore, and ended up with the tin starting to come out before the copper. Who knows? I'm sure that some experimentation could find that out. But a lot of these questions, or not as many as we would like to for prehistory, can often be broken down with that practical approach of experimental archaeology, which is, I guess, the area that I put myself in.
Yeah, my understanding of the copper smelting process is, at one end you've got natural copper, which is fairly easy, but to extract it from, is it the malachite?
That's one of the ores, malachite, yeah.
That is a multi-stage process, and it's really very sophisticated. And when you watch it being done, you think it's that very question: how, if you establish those three or how many steps it is from one stage to the other to finally end up with some globs of copper in the bottom of a messy whatever it is, mixed in with all the charcoal that falls out as well. It's just extraordinary.
Yeah.
And it must have seemed like some kind of magic, and those that could do it afforded some very special places in society rather than just your common or garden metal worker.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and you often see on TV and people talk about that. Well, people watching molten metal in prehistory be poured into a sword or cast out as raw metal. It must have been a magical process, but after it was done the first time, they would have been used to it. It would have been a fairly standard procedure. People would have probably had some reasonable grasp of the process. It's magical today because we don't see molten metal very much at all.
Yeah.
But it's quite interesting. But as I've said before, at some point when we're all roughly in the same country, you'll have to come and have a go.
We'll do that.
The process isn't
looking forward to that already.
It's an interesting process, and I think that there could be more focus on the resources that go around mining and smelting. I mean, people always sort of overlook charcoal. How do you make charcoal? It's a very complicated process. Involves a lot of axes, a lot of woodland, and a lot of time. And it's just like, they had charcoal. Yeah, but how do you make it? It's not the sort of thing you can just carry around easily.
Yeah, it's so true. People think it's just burnt wood, but no.
Talking of copper, though, James, with all the skills that you've developed over the years, in stonework, flint work, copperwork, metalwork, do you think you've got a greater insight into the way of life that someone like Otzi the Iceman, for example, the way he lived life, and what his kind of mindset was, do you think your work gives you an understanding that maybe someone who's more spent their life in academic study could achieve? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I suppose I stand between that interesting ground of a craftsperson and an academic. And I would always say that I was a craftsperson before an academic. I've just built that academic background around my interest of craft, which is brilliant because I can just either look behind me and sort of grab something off the shelf or remember some obscure reference to back up something I'm saying, or the rest of it's just made up. You just don't know it because I know which the reference list. But it's I suppose if I was to sit down and think about the way that I guess a good example would be going out on a walk, for example, as many of us have had to try and do for our daily exercise. The worst place for me to be taken is a woodland because everyone else will be walking along and, oh, look, there's a nice bird over there. And there'll be me looking up at the tree thinking, that branch make a good axe hand, or looking down, that whatever it is will make a good this, or that conifer root would make a good binding for that. And it's, I've often thought that for people in prehistory, they must have had this mental catalogue of things, that certain colours or shapes of things would have just stood out to them. And I've often noticed before that I've just glanced something out the corner of my eye, a certain colour or a certain shape, and I've been drawn to it because I recognise that's what I've aimed for so many times in making an axe handle or whatever. And for the people I'm with, it's, what are you looking at? So if you look, you can see the shape of the branch. It's just there, and that's where the axe head would be. It's an example of many, but it's likely there must have been that kind of mindset as well to some extent. And I guess for people who are used to foraging, it's something quite similar. Or for people field walking, quite similar. You're looking at certain shapes and colours.
Otzi in particular, himself, I mean, he had a very neat set of tools, chosen for portability. I don't know. But it's that kind of question when you've got a tool set like that. Do you instantly go, oh, that makes sense? Or do you
sometimes
find yourself having to make things up,
Yeah. I mean, I suppose with Otzi's toolkit, it's very worn out, and I can recognise the fact that it's very worn out, and it's not. Although the styles of objects are very contemporary with burials from around that part of Europe, his knife, arrowheads, other toolkits have been very, very reflaked and worn out. We've got a life assemblage with Otzi, whereas for other objects, again from the same time period, that match are burial assemblage objects. So I suppose in situations like that, you can recognise how things might be used, and perhaps even recognise things you might do yourself, and use a certain tool in a certain way that you can't easily create as archaeological data just by thinking about it, because how could you? You certainly couldn't with any kind of substance to it, because you need to go through that process of trying and making things, but with experience. It's all well and good, even for my PhD, which is not about copper smelting or bronze casting or very much flint knapping, was looking at early Upper Paleolithic orignation hunting technology. For part of the experiment, I wanted to test the way the spears with the split base antler point would function as a javelin. I really wanted to have a go in that experiment throwing these things, but I'm not a particularly experienced javelin thrower, so it was more representative to get some experienced javelin throwers to do it themselves. And I suppose this is where you have to start deconstructing these various processes in experimental archaeology and think about not just the objects themselves, but the people around them, the parts of the equation that no longer exist or we can't find.
Yeah.
Interesting, because you saying that, well, we were also we didn't realise until looking into your background that you've researched the origins of archery as well.
Yeah, It's
that's interesting. So how far back have you sort of taken that technique-wise?
As early as it can go. I mean, pretty much from the transition from spear throwers through to the earliest possible evidence of archery, and the earliest evidence seems to come from places like is it Hornstein Vogelstang, where they've got fragments of pine limbs that could be bows, or for the likes of Stelmore, which there's hundreds of arrows that were found with fragments of bows, sadly all lost or mostly lost during the Second World War, but right on the cusp of the Upper Paleolithic. And it's only a little bit later, as we go into the Mesolithic, that we start to get more complete bows from the likes of Tiebrun in Denmark. But I mean, there are so many aspects of what I do, whether it be flint knapping, casting, archery, projectiles, dwellings, food, you name it, that either through the process of learning or having to learn about something, I've had to sort of expand my knowledge, or just via pure interest. So it gets to that point where you've certainly at events, or when you're talking to people, you have to have a very broad understanding. And I'll be the first person happy to say, I don't quite know the answer to that question because it's such a specific question, but I'm sure I'll know someone or come across a reference. And it's the beauty of somewhere like Twitter. There's so many specialists that I often say, I'm not sure about this. You've got a much better opinion on it or more experience. But it's a big, long time period, prehistory, as you both well know. There's been lots of people, lots of objects made, and at times you start to worry about what you're forgetting and what you're remembering. Some information comes in and the rest of it starts to disappear out the other end, and it's you have to keep reminding yourself. And I feel like I've gone through books a couple of times, like, oh, that's interesting, I didn't know that existed. You think, I did know that, I read that a couple of years ago.
It's actually quite frightening how much you realise you've forgotten, isn't it?
Yeah, totally.
You've got a vast array of skills, starting with the flint knapping, but it's spread out, very, very broadly indeed. If you had to travel back in time in prehistory, which bit of prehistory would you go to, and then how would you rate your chances of survival and assimilation?
I've often been asked similar questions to that, but not quite as specific as that. And I suppose that's the key bit, is that you often get asked, "Oh, would you go back in time, and when would you go? Would you find out what Stonehenge was used for if you had your one chance?" And my response is, well, the trouble is with somewhere like Stonehenge is if you went back in time and they used it exactly in the way that archaeologists have suggested, it's kind of an opportunity wasted. You're not going to sort of come back and say, "Oh, they used it for this." It's, well, yeah, we guessed that. And if you come back and it was made by some obscure methods of construction, shall we say, to sort of not suggest alternate theories, no one would believe you. So it'd be another wasted reason to go back to it.
That can't be true.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. I mean, I guess there are certain questions in both the casting process or flint knapping that I would love to be answered. And it's the sort of thing that may well be answered as my experience develops, or I may never be able to answer it. And it's I've often contemplated this question, and I'm really not sure, because there are so many parts of prehistory that are interesting. And that's why I will always argue it's the best period of time, because it's the longest, and surely that makes it the best. But there's so much to it that makes it very interesting. I mean, the trouble is with after prehistory, certainly in Britain and much of Europe, when you got the Romans, it's all a bit square and regulated, really. You find one villa and they're kind of all that shape. You expect the same assemblage of pottery. But with prehistory, it's often so varied. And there's so many different factors that I've found that contribute to the way that people lived and made things that we end up with. And why are the stone tools this shape, whereas a few hundred miles away from 1,000 years apart, stone tools are a completely different shape? could be culture, could be climate, it could be fusion of two cultures. We'll never know.
I suppose the spin on my question was, how you rate your own chances of survival and all that is a kind of, your own reflection on your own skills, and how close you're feeling I mean, it is experimental archaeology, and is the clue down through the actual doing of the work to get into the mindset? Do you think that's taken you down a path that gets you close more than, say, pure academic study?
Yeah, definitely. And because you're in that, certainly for something like flint knapping, you're thinking about the angles. And as I close my eyes, I can sort of see the last piece of flint I was working on. You recognise in certain features that you can or cannot hit that platform for whatever reason, or those steps ahead as you're going for it. And that thought pattern will be very, very similar, but I'm making that tool for a very different purpose. Typically, it's to fulfill an order to go to some museum. I'm not making it purely for the process of cutting something or to provide an object to complete a task that may or may not help your survival. So it's quite different. And I suppose if I did purposely put myself in that survival environment, you'd be even closer to that similar mindset. But I suppose there'd still be some of that mindset of thinking, oh, this is interesting. I wonder if I do have that similar mindset. And, I suppose you're starting to get levels of thought, trains of thought, or even levels of theory of mind that start to become very complicated and convoluted away from what you were originally trying to think about. So although it's very interesting, I try not to think about it too much because I think I'll go mad. Simply, it's you just can't try and contemplate everything. Prehistory's too big, and I know that if I'm lucky enough to have many, many more years of life, I will get to near the end and think, I still don't know everything, and you accept that. And that's why, for certain parts of my interest in crafts, there are lots of crafts I'd like to know more about and be more proficient at, but you can't be good at everything.
We hear you.
Well, you're saying that you do a lot of public engagement, and you run courses and you do demonstrations and that kind of thing. How easy is it to learn the basic skills of flint knapping?
You're going to find out at some point in the near future.
I hope so.
Yeah, it's very difficult, I suppose. And I would always say to people wanting to have a go is that be prepared to be frustrated initially. Although you might have seen pictures of lovely stone tools, either on TV or even a social media feed, just set yourself small goals about taking off a flake, because most stone tools that were used in prehistory were just flakes. It's in the ratio of just flakes to finished multifaceted bifacial tools is going to be much bigger. But I suppose if I was to put it in a nutshell, rather than me go off on a big tangent again, is flint knapping has often been compared to a game of chess in the way that you can do certain things. And like on a chessboard, certain pieces can only move in certain places. And it's quite similar. You can't just bash the flint in the middle. You have to do one step before another, which shows the intense level of cognition involved hundreds of thousands of years ago. However, a chessboard has set parameters. It has a set size. The opponent can only do the same thing as you. Whereas the flint can be a completely different shape, different hardness, different fossils and faults in it all the time. So rather than playing a game of chess against a human opponent, it's more like, and bear with me, more like playing a game of chess against a pigeon. Because you're trying to... Mike's not listening. Really? Is he? Bear with me. You're putting the pieces forward as you're trying to advance to go through that piece of flint or advance across the chessboard. And if the flint wants to behave, then you can carry on. But if the flint doesn't want to behave and it's got a nasty fossil or crack in it, it won't want to play. And just like the pigeon, it will just knock all the pieces over and poo all over the board. you've got to navigate that.
Okay, that's a good analogy.
It's I think it's one that's come about by many kilos of gravelled flint and much frustration over the years. So it's difficult, but if you can start to understand both your reasonable objectives and a little bit about the fracture mechanic, that's half the battle, and the rest of it is just getting your hands to hit that 0.5 millimeter space consistently.
So even when we're looking at what seems like a relatively simple handaxe, there is a huge thought process that needs to go into that before stone hits hone or antler hits stone.
To some extent, after a while, a lot of it becomes instinct, and for something like a handaxe...
Well, there's the thing, that after a while.
That's the key bit. And I suppose for something like a handaxe, that might have been the third one they've ever made, or the 30th, or their 300th handaxe. And I suppose getting behind that level of thought that goes into the cognition of flint knapping starts to get quite tricky when you've just got a finished stone tool, because it might have been a completely different stone tool that's been worn down and reflaked into something else. Which brings into play a completely different mindset of reuse. So, yes, I mean, for something like the Valois is a good example, the way that Neanderthals and later could look at a core and create a flake of a predetermined shape and size by understanding the mechanics of the stone. I mean, it clearly demonstrates an intense level of forethought and understanding of the rock. And I suppose, when we get round to it and, I put that piece of flint in front of both of you, we'll be able to work out on where on the scale you would be on that level of cognition, whether you're right at the upper Paleolithic Solutrean level, or whether you're a very competent Acheulean napper, or a rather good Levallois napper, or whether you're a totally rubbish Bronze Age napper. I guess we'll soon find out.
Yeah. Actually, it's a fascinating point. When you come to the other end of the scale, when you've got a Solutrean biface thing going on, I mean, they're extraordinary as far as the deep skills are concerned. I think there was, because we're doing quite well for time, there was another question I wanted to ask you, and that was to do with your understanding of how flaking occurs and different styles of knapping. Is it through the experimental archaeology, if you like, that it becomes more apparent how you can separate one culture out from another in terms of how they did things? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, to some extent. I think it's very difficult to try and pin culture to styles of knapping, because you're always going to be restrained by set parameters of the way the stone fractures to some extent. But I can see what you're asking is that why people make tools of a certain shape and size, loosely. Yeah. And we literally yesterday just premiered on the YouTube channel video about Solutrean spearheads, and a lot of the questions were along the lines of why did they make these oversized spearheads? They're very unlike the tools before and very unlike the tools after, in a very specific part of southwestern France and Iberia. They're just so completely different, but they're not the only spearheads that were in use during the Solutrean. They're much smaller spearheads that are made from blades, which is more consistent with the rest of the Upper Paleolithic timeline. So why did people go to that extent? And I suppose we have to try and consider some of those external factors that might have led to those decisions. Was it a luxury available of raw material? Could be, but other parts of Europe during the Upper Paleolithic had lots of good quality stone, so that's not necessarily the one answer to that. Was it a cultural reason? Possibly, but where did it come from to make both unifacial tools and the key bit being two-faced bifacial great big spearheads, these laurel leaf Vogel style spearheads? They just seem to appear a real anomaly. could it be something to do with the climate and the effect that would have? Because for many researchers, they've pointed out that the Solutrean in that region tends to follow the course of the last glacial maximum, when the glaciers were at their maximum extent. And what implications could that have on the environment and the people that live within them? Well, clearly it would have been very cold. And a very cold place brings its own set of problems or opportunities. You'll get certain types of prey, or certain herds of prey, I suppose. So is it a question of prey specialisation or hunting strategy, or a combination? And I suppose this is where we have to start picking apart features in the landscape, the styles of hunting, access to certain types of raw material, or even prey specialisation. And it may be that having both these much heavier, what are almost certainly lances, thrusting spears, there's no way you throw one of those things, it's just gone. But to have a heavier lance in your arsenal with a set of lighter spears could suggest that these people were extremely adaptable in very, very challenging conditions for somewhere so cold. If you're hunting animals, you might have people, let's set a scenario to try and put into perspective how these tools might be used. We've got our hunters who are trying to herd herds of horses at Solutrean or reindeer or bison. It's likely that they would be trying to encourage them to move along with lighter spears and javelins, because they can start to pitch them at a point to scare them and send them in a certain direction. If you've got groups appearing in certain places to help try to funnel them into a gorge or up against a rock face, for example, somewhere to really bottle them up, you could then have a group of hunters who are ready with the finishing tools, these heavier lances that are going to, with a lot of force behind them, deal lethal wounds at very short range. So it may be that for whether it be origination split-base points, Dufour bladelets or Solutrean spearheads, that there is almost certainly a mixture of culture, climatic factors, environmental factors that play into the decisions that these people make. And rather than just appreciating the way that stone tools develop, I suppose appreciating the way that humans are able to adapt and produce products to meet problems in that adaptability is a greater representation of stone tools.
There's a big missing, I think, in all this. I don't know if you want to say a few words about it. And that is, we ain't going nowhere with these tools unless we've got glue of some sort. Am I right in that?
Yeah. With some tools, anyway. For something like many of the lithic stone tool spearheads, you would need some kind of glue, and more and more evidence is appearing about earlier and earlier use of glue, which tends to be birch tar produced through dry distilling of the tar out of the bark, to produce an artificial product in places where modern humans had never been, for Neanderthal groups that could make birch tar. Again, it just shows that a very, very deep set of skills and understanding of raw materials and how to achieve them, whether it be binding and making string to attach them, or whether you needed glue at all. If you intentionally made hunting tools where the head came off once it was in the animal, and you could just quickly shove a split-based point onto a spearhead and go for the next animal when it was in the corral. It's all about decision making, and I suppose we've got to try and reconstruct those decisions.
So, James, what have you got coming up? Oh, congratulations on your website, by the way. I think it looks absolutely fabulous, and I presume that is the principal place to find you. It's at AncientCraft.co.uk. AncientCraft.co.com, is it? .co.uk.
Yeah, that's the work of my partner Em, who's been doing the YouTube videos and has put her skills to the website as well. So I've provided a bit of the information and pictures, but most of the work is hers. So it's she's done a fantastic job.
Oh well, congrats to her.
Yeah, definitely.
She's
Congratulations,
doing a fabulous job there.
It looks good, and it's because you've been up it's well over 10 years now, isn't it?
Must be coming up to 13 years or so. So it's as museums are starting to reopen, it's encouraging to see lots of orders coming in, but encouraging to see that they're being brave in the sense that, we need to prepare for people coming in, because as I've said, once we're all allowed to go off and visit places around the UK, people are going to want something to do and places to visit. So it's a good opportunity for museums. I've worked with Creswell Crags quite a lot because they were getting quite close to real financial concerns. And for a site that I visited as a kid, my dad took me there and accidentally stumbled across a bison rib sticking out of some earth, which they now have in their stores. It's, again, another one of these places that inspired me as a kid, and they will keep going. If I have anything to be involved with it, I will get their profile up and keep them going.
Oh, wow. That is something. We haven't been to Creswell, and something we must do, Rupert.
Indeed. So many places to go. Yeah. That's a list that's never going to get any shorter.
No, certainly not.
If we could synchronise visits, that would be good.
Yeah. And they're a really, really nice group there, and we've done a little bit of filming there. They're very, certainly if you're heading down that way, let them know, or let us know. It'd be a good little short project, maybe.
We will definitely do that. I'm very conscious that time is running away with us now. So where can people go to find out more about you and your courses and everything else when that opens up?
Well, my website is ancientcraft.co.uk, or my social media handle is just at AncientCraft UK, whether it be Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. But if people have got questions about parts of prehistory or about me, God knows why, but do just ping me across, whether it be an email or a tweet or whatever. I can usually often get questions about, I found something, is it a stone tool? Yes or no, mostly. But I can often direct people to more qualified people in particular fields of lithic technology. I mean, I make the blooming things, but there's so many millions of them out there, you can't be a specialist in them all.
Well, we've floated across the surface of your expertise, I think, to a certain extent. Obviously, there are so many deep dives we could take into any aspect of the stuff we do. And I hope at some point in the future we do manage to come back and revisit maybe do some a bit narrower attention, pay a bit narrower attention to knapping or stonework or polishing or... whatever. But in the meantime, James, it's been an absolute delight talking to you. And
it really has. Long overdue. So thanks again for joining us.
Delight to chat to you both. I've listened to your shows and watched them for a long time. So, there's only you're part of a very small sect of podcasts and radio shows that I listen to. So it's definitely
we
been...
are deeply honoured.
As you'd have to ask the family. It's the levels of excitement have been quite high.
That's fantastic.
Very cool indeed. Well, folks, listeners, watchers on YouTube, hope you enjoyed that, and you know now where to send your questions.
Absolutely, prehistory. But please don't.
Thank you, James.
So much, James.
Thanks, folks. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.